All right, so we are looking at so this is where it's going to say chapter 16 here. Every day moving forward is going to be in chapter 16. So we are officially into your regular NASM textbook, chapter 16, every single day for the end of this course. And that's just because like all chapter 16 is just a really brief paragraph or two on like whatever condition or disease, like a little bit of background information, like what it is, why it is, and things like that. And then it goes into like a table at the end, which I'll just kind of skip forward and show you here. It's kind of a table that looks like this that has like basic exercise guidelines, and you can use this information to basically fill in SOAP notes. Not that the NASM chapter 16 is actually even teaching you SOAP notes. That's actually something that Sochi's doing. The SOAP notes thing is really meant to be something that like you may run into in your careers. But because we're not doing an actual program design class here, and some students who are like newer haven't been through a program design class, we're doing like sort of the SOAP note approach. But basically all this info is general information on like how to fill stuff in. So that's what we'll be looking at for the rest of this course. So today we are looking at, this is going to be day 3, which is going to be looking at youth and senior populations. So ironically, some of our students, I know Robert, you've been through our youth class. So some of this is going to be like the really like stripped down, super bare bones information on youth fitness training. As we are looking at it, right? Oh, and then, I'm just going to say this now. This class, there's just not a lot of content today. We're going to try and make it like last a while, but like there's going to be like I said, this is one of our exceptionally shorter classes. So we are going to see how long this goes. But if we're looking at defining a youth population, right? So in terms of like, when we say youths, what we mean is we're referring to grouping together both like children and adolescents, right? So a child is going to be anywhere from ages like 2 to 11. Generally, you don't work with any, it's not like we're training 2-year-olds, like making them do burpees and stuff. Generally, if you start like doing any type of like fitness training, which is typically game based, as we've talked about in our youth classes, that's going to be like ages like 6 and higher. And then generally in traditional like gym settings, you actually end up more in like the adolescent range, which is going to be anywhere from like, you can see here 12 to 20, even though like I know 18 in the US, right? There's a little bit of an inconsistency here between like NASM's information, like in the youth fitness training manual versus like the information in your average textbook. I think in the youth fitness manual, it's 12 to 19. But that's sort of like what we're seeing in terms of like children versus adolescents there. In a traditional gym setting, you'll probably actually not see 12-year-olds, considering that like most gyms, if they are like an LA Fitness 24-hour, like whatever, most standard gyms start at age like 14, bare minimum, in order to be able to like be on the weight room floor. Again, though, we are going to see like general recommendations in terms of activity. We just talked about this on Friday, right? Average amount of activity that we want an adult to get is 150 minutes per week of low to moderate intensity activity. And we want to see like 75 minutes per week of high intensity activity. But when it comes to recommendations for youths and adolescents, right? Your youths in general, what we see is that we want to get about 60 minutes up to more per day, right? So every single day we're hoping to get at least an hour's worth of activity. So youth fitness programs, very big growing segment in the US. We see that like more than 7% of US children and adolescents were hindered in their daily activities by some type of chronic disease. So we definitely know that like chronic diseases are climbing, not only in like adults across the US, but also in youths as well. So one of the best ways to combat that, right, again, is going back to our general approach to just physical activity, right? We know that physical activity has really positive effects on certain diseases. So our recommendations for youths are going to be 60 minutes per day, right? And then like children ages like 5 to 12 as well, 60 minutes up to several hours per day, right? So currently we want to get like, if you've got an adolescent, at least an hour a day. Children want to get even more than that. So, and when we say activity, it doesn't need to be like working out, right? It just needs to be like outside playing games, doing something physical, right? Um, and this is just a very important part of like ensuring that like one of the messages that we really wanted to talk a lot about in our youth training class is it's not really about making like the world's most athletic youth, right? It's really much more about developing like a person with healthy habits that they can carry into adulthood. So that is something that we're seeing there. Um, let me see here. Yeah. So, what are some of the causes? We know again these chronic illnesses are kind of growing fast. So, what do we think some of the common causes are? Well, some of the reasons we think can be cultural, right? Like obviously your cultural impact can, your cultural environment can directly impact like your diet and exercise protocols. You know, like I come from like, my parents are generally like sitters for the most part. Like they like to kind of sit around. They like watching a lot of TV and like a lot of movies and things like that and talking about their day because they have very physical jobs, you know, like they're furniture movers. Like that is pretty exhausting. So when I get home from the day, they're pretty wiped out. And so like culturally, that's definitely something like I grew up around. Like to me, like both of my parents like worked, so it's like dinner time in my head still to this day. Like I remember going over to friends' houses and they'd be like, "Hey, come on over for dinner," and it'd be like it's like 5 p.m. and I was like, "Wow, my parents would have dinner at like 8 p.m." because they'd just be exhausted from work and then they'd have to like try to relax for a little bit and then they would start making dinner. So that's like a kind of a weird thing that like I grew up, so like my interpretation of that's a little bit different. So culturally that's a thing. Also culturally, I know like in my family, Robert, I don't know if you feel this way, but I have this weird thing. um like my parent, like meals are always like a three course thing, right? There's always like a carb and a protein and some type of veggie. Like and so like I'd sometimes go over to like kids' houses and they'd be like, my mom made like a big pot of soup for dinner. It's like soup for dinner. Soup is what you have before dinner. like my brain, like culturally, that's just like something I grew up around. So I don't know if you've experienced something similar to that, but like, I think you're just a reflection of sort of what you grew up around,
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. Mine was mostly we were mainly carbs and protein. We really didn't have a lot of veggies growing up, so
that can be really common too. Yeah. And like by veggies, my parents would be like, yeah, be like a can of corn. It's like
yeah,
can
or yeah, or
things like
some
that.
green beans or something. Yeah.
Yeah, right. It's like okay.
Mm.
So that could certainly influence like a youth's behavior, especially into adulthood. Socially as well, like social environments that you grow up in directly affect that as well. Like my family, like I was the only child growing up, so there wasn't like a lot of like big family meals. It was usually just like something for the three of us. Which is good and bad, like it has its benefits. It definitely meant that like there weren't like massively oversized portions where it led to like overeating habits or anything like that. Other social impacts are like, I grew up in like a neighborhood that wasn't exactly like very wealthy. So a lot of times, like, this is something that I think is actually kind of a positive. A lot of like what you wanted to spend time like doing activity wise was like physical, it was a lot of like going outdoors and just doing things like that. But at the same time, flipping it around where I like based on like what I grew up on, that was like geographic, that has a huge impact. I know like here in LA, for instance, like we're definitely in like a very like heavy in a city metropolitan environment. And so there's not a lot of like backyards and things like that. So that could definitely lead to some physical inactivity, but LA is pretty good about having like different parks in different places. So geographically, that could certainly be like a factor there. I know it was like it rained a lot where I was growing up, and so like you just kind of got used to playing out in the rain. um, but some people like if it's like blizzards and things like that, or if it's super hot, both of those things are going to affect whether or not you can kind of go outside. So that might be impacting. If we're looking at our reasons why like obesity and chronic illnesses are growing in youths, maybe some of these things are factors. A lot of times it can certainly be economic, right? Economic factors can definitely affect like your ability to afford healthy foods here and there. Um, And sometimes, you know, don't get me wrong, I would actually argue that healthy foods are often cheaper because you can cook them yourselves, like you know exactly what's in it. And so like when you buy raw ingredients and whip them up yourselves, economically, I think that actually saves you money. But the amount of time it takes to do that sometimes isn't very practical if you're working a million hours a week. So that's definitely a possibility there. We see nutritional factors is obviously huge. Different people have different like takes on what they believe is like nutritious. You know, I always tell people this. My mom does this constantly. My mom will be so proud of herself. This is heartbreaking. I'll be so proud of herself, and she'll send me a picture of like something that she thinks is healthy every now and then. She's like, "Look, we had a healthy dinner," and it'll be like a giant piece of chicken, and then like a giant thing of mashed potatoes and like a little thing of like steamed broccoli. And I'm like, the components are there, you know. And I'll always just kind of send her like small little notes back. I'm like, that's really great. Like next time, leave the skin on the potatoes. You know, make them lumpy and stuff. That way, you get a little more fiber in your diet. Let's see if we can double the size of that broccoli and cut the chicken in half. You know, maybe lose a little bit of the mashed potatoes. And so little changes like that, right? Like nutritional factors are obviously huge. And then genetics and family habits obviously are going to play a role in overall health factors as well. We do know that like youths, just like adults, are going to be, you know, subject to your own biology. If you come from, you know, a long line of people who tend to be like very fidgety and active, you're probably going to be very fidgety and active as well. So that's definitely another thing that we do see there. So those are some of our factors that could be increasing our risks for chronic disease or lowering them. You know, like again, they're all just things that we need to consider. And the only reason we are covering something like this is we want to make sure that we know that like the things that lead to, you know, lead to our health outcomes, it's all like based on our background, right? And so like these are questions that you can ask, you know, parents and stuff. If you are training like a youth, you can be like, well, what type of activity do they usually get per day? What does your home environment look like? Do you have a lot of like in-cooked meals, or do you order out a lot? These are all questions that you can ask, which can help you kind of fill in the blanks and figure out like where your youth background is kind of coming from. So talking about some of the physiologic differences between youths and adults, we do know that children are going to experience similar effects to exercise. You know, there are going to be, you know, when you exercise, your body goes, oh man, I'm not good at whatever we were doing there, and so I need to get better, and then it adapts to that exercise, right? And so we know that youth can experience that as well. However, because of that, their progressions are certainly going to be a little bit different. We're still going to be using NASM's OPT model whenever we are designing programs for children and youths and seniors or whatever. We're still going to use the OPT model. It's very relevant here. We just want to make sure that we stay in very specific sections. And Davion and Noel, I know you guys are the new guys. You know, the OPT model is basically determining what type of training you are going to be applying to your youths. So our progressions might be a little different. Our starting points might be a little bit different, but that is sort of how that's going to work. Now, some of the physiologic differences we see, children are actually going to have like a peak oxygen uptake rather than a VO2 max. So we talked a little bit about like the volume of oxygen consumed at like maximum when we were looking at prescribing exercise intensity and understanding things like that. Children are less efficient at absorbing oxygen. And so they're not quite as good at that. So instead, what will happen is a lot of times, like the room for improvement in a youth is fairly limited. It's not that they can't get better at like cardiovascular training. Well, it is kind of like they can't get that much better. It's not that they can't get better at all. It's just that it's somewhat limited, and that's just because of like the size of their bodies. You know, like their heart's only so large. Their lungs are only so large. Oxygen molecules are still the same size. Red blood cells are still the same size. So like, because the blood vessels, the heart and things like that are fairly limited, we don't experience like a very large in growing of our heart until we get past puberty. So because of that, they're going to have a peak oxygen uptake. And that's where like basically youths across the board at certain ages are expected to perform cardio in a certain capacity. They're also less efficient at higher intensities of their VO2 max. So one thing that is very true about youths is that they do not produce enough like glycolytic enzymes to be very good at high intensity exercise. That is to say that like when we are exercising at an intensity where you would get exhausted from about 0 to 60 seconds, if you're working hard enough that like, you shouldn't be able to do more than 60 seconds of exercise, youths are not going to have a very good capacity to grow in that short of a time frame. So they're very inefficient at anaerobic, like non-oxygen requiring exercise. And so they're not as good at lifting very, very heavy or at high percentages of their 1 rep max. So it's not that youths cannot get stronger; they absolutely can. It's just that they don't perform very well in that energy systems range. And we know that like when we look at our energy systems, right? Let me see if I can just pull these up here. Workout and duration. So here's a really brief, here's a really brief like overview of how our energy systems work. Like this chart is meant to show you where your energy is coming from. You get your, like in the very beginning, and this down here represents how long the exercise is. So the shorter the exercise, if it's really short, like 0 to like 10 seconds, you can see a lot of the energy is coming from this ATP-PC system. That's a very anaerobic, without oxygen energy system. This is maximal intensity. When you're lifting at your 1 rep max, and you do maybe 5 repetitions, that's a really high percentage of your maximum intensity. So you're primarily training this anaerobic energy system here, the ATP-PC system. Then as you continue going on, let's say you go, up to about 2 minutes in time, right? 30 seconds up to 2 minutes. And 2 minutes, by the way, is a long time. We're really looking like 30 to 60 seconds here. Most of your energy is coming from glycolysis, which is also an anaerobic energy system. This is the one that produces massive amounts of lactic acid. And so we'll produce a lot of energy right in here in that very short-term energy system. So the immediate energy, which is hyper short-term, we have short-term. And then we have your aerobic system, which has been slowly working in the background and is picking up. And then what's awesome is like, you'll notice, you can kind of see it in the chart here, it kind of flattens out. Your aerobic energy system goes for, at 2 minutes, basically into infinity. So your aerobic energy system supplies most of the energy in terms of like, this is why we can marathon, you think about like a marathon as a several hour event versus like lifting weights, which might be a several second event, right? And so children not so good at either of these first 2 energy systems, like this one or this one, but they're really quite good at this aerobic energy system. When you think of kids, you think of like these little beings that have energy all day, right? Well, that's very much like an aerobic energy system thing. It's like they get exercise and then they never get tired and they're like the Energizer bunny and you just go, 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 right? But all of that is at a relatively low intensity, and so if you want, that's what we're looking at. We look at intensities. High intensity is short duration, low intensity is long duration. Children are very, very good at the long duration, low intensity stuff. So now children can develop strength and they can develop bone density. However, do not mistake strength for muscle mass. Those are definitely different things, right? So rarely will children experience like hypertrophy, like muscular growth, but they will get stronger. So they will like improve. Most of that strength is neurological. Most of that is their brain learning how to do those movements more efficiently. And so they'll get better at the movements, even though they're not necessarily gaining massive amounts of muscle or anything like that. And then again, we're seeing that high intensity. So that's all. You can see all of this is related. So like, if we know all of this is true, right? If we know that we have this like person that we're going to train that is not so good at short-term energy, they don't really have the ability to gain muscle mass very efficiently. And they don't produce enough glycolytic enzymes to kind of stay in one energy system in order to maintain high intensity. Sounds to me like the conclusions we should draw is we should not do high intensity exercise with our youths, right? Sounds like we should do low intensity, high duration. We should take advantage of their strengths, which is this long-term energy system that they have. And so primarily what we're going to see down here when we get to our basic guidelines we are going to very much focus on greater like length duration style like workout programming, right? We're gonna create a lot of like um, long-term, circuit training, lots of stuff that gets their heart rate elevated and keeps their heart rate elevated. They may not be able to lift very much weight, but we're still going to keep them moving the entire time. So when it comes to resistance training, sometimes people are like, oh, you should never do resistance training with use. It can stunt their growth. And there's literally no evidence to suggest that that is true. So feel free to do strength training with kids. Again, they don't really have the ability to gain massive amounts of muscle mass. So I wouldn't exactly do like bodybuilding training with youths, but it does not mean that you cannot do strength training, right? You can absolutely do that with your youths. And so we want to make sure that we are going to do that because they can lower their risk for injuries. We know that like strength training trains our youths in specific ways that strengthen their muscles, ligaments, and tendons. And so that reduces our risk for energy. So we still can use the OPT model. Our progressions are a little bit different. We're going to focus primarily on phases 1, 2, and 5, which you'll notice if you look at this table here, you will see this is our general like 1, 2, and 5 area, right? What's up, Noel? Good to have you. So when we're looking at it, right, remember our FIT principles we talked about Friday? You're going to notice this still somewhat follows our FIT principles, although it doesn't break it down with the same like terminology. But the mode that works best, right? So like we're picking frequency, intensity, time, type, right? That's the mode. The mode that works best when we're training like youths are going to be things like walking or jogging or going for a run, right? All of those are great. But generally, the best forms are going to be things like playing different types of fitness games, doing different types of fitness activities, playing sports. Water activities are great. Like, kids have a blast when they're in the pool. And then resistance training can still be effective with youths. We just want to make sure, like I said, we are focusing on low intensity resistance training rather than high intensity resistance training. Not so much because it's like a safety factor, just because like they don't have the ability to grow in that capacity. So why are you wasting your time, So those are our modes that we are most often going to consider. Our frequency, we're going to see 5 to 7 days per week. So we see a pretty high level of frequency there. And that's because kids tend to recover really quickly. And because you are lifting at a low intensity, the lower the intensity, the more often you can train. So that's good. Intensity here for cardiorespiratory exercise can be moderate to vigorous, meaning that we want to focus on the aerobic energy system there. I don't really like how I wish this part of this drives me crazy because they do it later on where they start giving VO2 percentages. And I don't know why they don't do it on this youth one, but I always remember this table and I hate this table a little bit just because they just got done talking about how low intensity is so important. And this is moderate to vigorous exercise training. It doesn't say intensity. So the intensity is actually, we're not making kids do sprints and then recover. We're making them do sprints and then not recover. Right. And so that way, like they get very, very out of breath and it feels very intense, very, very, very hard. It does not feel very intense. Remember, there's a difference between hard and intense. Like the marathon is the least intense thing in the world. It's an event that takes hours, right? That could not be lower in terms of intensity. Does not mean that it's not hard. That marathon is exceptionally difficult. There's a difference between the two, right? Intensity is a percentage of your maximum effort. In a marathon, you are applying minimal effort over a very extended period of time versus powerlifting, which is, where you literally do one rep of something on a stage and then you set it down and you're done for the day, right? Like that is the highest intensity event where it's like, wham, drop it, I'm out, like it doesn't get any lower. It does not get any lower in terms of duration. It does not get any higher in terms of intensity. So, the intensity here, I hate the fact that they wrote it this way they can write it this way, but I hate the fact they didn't put like percentages here of VO2 max. We want them to be like out of breath, basically the whole workout. We just want them to get them there, start them moving and just get them exhausted and then send them home, Duration is going to be 60 minutes and I don't know why they have to put per day here, but 60 minutes is going to be a great duration for our youths. And so again, everyday training, 5 to 7 days per week, and kids, they bounce back really quickly. So we can train at a very high frequency there. Now, the types of assessments that are effective for our youths, right? So remember, the assessments are, when you're going through like your SOAP notes and things like that, which assessments and which information do you feel is very relevant to your client? In this case, because it's a youth client, we know overhead squats are going to be a really good assessment to do because that's going to tell us about overactive and underactive muscles. You're pretty much going to see the overhead squat in almost every table, I think, throughout this whole course. But also, rather than doing like, let's say, we know that you can do the bench press assessment, right? The upper extremity strength assessment, the lower extremity strength assessment, right? But are those really that important for our youth clients? Again, no, because like high intensity benching is not relevant to youth because they don't really have that energy system or that capacity to grow in that way. So instead, we have the 10 push-up assessment. And basically what we're looking for is, can you do 10 push-ups all the way down like chin, a couple inches from the ground, all the way down, all the way back up? That's sort of what we look for. And so we look to see like, do we need to improve that or not in our youths, right? We also have the single leg stance assessment, which is kind of similar to the single leg balance assessment, but basically you just have, somebody stand hands on their hips and raise, and if they can't really maintain their balance very effectively, then that's like a fail on the single leg stance assessment. So if they can perform that, then I would totally, and you can see it here, if they can tolerate it, go into the single leg squat assessment. That's a really good one as well. Single leg squat assessment, very similar to the overhead squat. It tells us a little bit about overactive, underactive muscles, but it also tells us about core strength and balance. And so like, it's a very handy assessment to perform. Your flexibility training, you can see here, this is where we also see a little bit of a disagreement. For those of you who have been through like our youth training class, you can see a little bit of a disagreement here. But flexibility wise, just follow the flexibility continuum specific for each phase of training. I know in the youth manual, it actually says to avoid active isolated stretches just because, again, they don't really have a great capacity to grow in that manner. But in this version, we can see if you're in, level 1, level 2, or level 3, you can focus on whichever stretches are most appropriate. And I think I mentioned that in the youth class, like it's not that you can't do active isolated stretches, it's just that active isolated stretches often benefit from your ability to contract on the opposite side of the joint, So like I'll contract my bicep so that it will stretch my tricep, and I'll contract my tricep so that it will stretch my bicep. Because youth don't have that great contraction ability. They just don't benefit super well from active isolated stretches, but it still can be an effective tool. And it can be a good way to change things up. Now, you can see here are our general rules for writing programs for youths, right? So in general, we're going to focus on about 1 to 2 sets between 8 to 12 repetitions at 40 to 70% of their 1 rep max, maybe 2 to 3 days per week. So I want to show you what that looks like if we were to write this out in SOAP note form, right? So you can see here's an example SOAP note for like a youth client, right? We got little Billy here. He's interested in soccer, video games, movies, TVs, and he likes swimming, and he's a big Spider-Man fan. Favorite foods are things like pizza, mac and cheese, and fries. Definitely a real kid, right? He's age 10, 85 pounds, 4'9". So we can see our assessments that are most relevant. We kind of copied these over. Overhead squat, 10 push-up assessment, single leg bounce. But we decided to throw a little bit of cardio his way. We want to do a quarter-mile run assessment as well and just see if that improves over time. So it's like, how fast can Billy run a quarter mile? Week 1, week 4, week 8, right? Just continue testing that. And then we got our plan section here, and I'll come back to this in a little bit, but you can see when it comes to resistance training, right? We're going to train with a trainer once per week, so we're much more doing like a coaching situation here. And our strength training is going to be 1 to 2 sets, 8 to 12 reps. We're going to mostly focus on body weight exercises because they are easy to understand. We're going to perform that circuit style because by performing circuit style, that's going to take some of the intensity and lower it and raise the cardiorespiratory demand, which again is generally our focus here, especially if he wants to be better at soccer, right? And we're going to focus on stabilization. We're going to be in the stabilization level. So for his cardio training, for his resistance training, and then we'll look at his flexibility training here in just a second. So again, we see phase 1 should be mastered before moving on to anything else. Phases 2 and 5 can be reserved for mature adolescents. based on like postural control, right? So again, you can do strength training with youths, but generally it's for like teenagers, right? Because Billy is what do we say, 10 years old? Um, yeah, because he's 10 years old. We're not really going to focus on like a lot of hypertrophy. So we're probably going to do a lot of stabilization, and we might bounce straight into the power phase where we can do like, lots of explosive, jumpy, fun stuff like that that challenges his cardio system without like keeping the intensity super, super high. Now, this is kind of fun. Special considerations. Progressions for youth population should be based on postural control and not on the amount of weight that can be used. So you're not trying to max out your youths. You're just trying to make sure they have good postural control. I kind of like this because in a way, this is like NASA admitting it's like, look, we all have that moment where we're like trying to get that weight up and you're like, maybe you do a little lean and then you succeed and you're like, I did, and you break through like a plateau. You did like a little bit of a cheat rep. I'm not wholly opposed to cheat reps. I do think that like people use them like every session and they should be used like once a month, like as like a plateau buster. But progressions should be based on postural control. If your client can do the entire exercise with perfect posture, then we can make it harder. And then our other special consideration, this is arguably the most important one, make your exercise fun. I mean, that should be true for any client, but is especially true for youths because we know if there's one thing that we know about kids, it's that they do not have the world's greatest attention span. So, all right. So how can we, so these are some questions you kind of want to ask yourself, right? How can you make training fun for youths, right? What do you have to do to sort of make that more entertaining for your youth clients? How do you plan to make your parents comfortable with like you training their son or daughter? I mean, obviously parents are going to be very protective of their children. So you want to make sure like, how do you ensure that like the program that you're writing shows to your parents that like, hey, this is really fun and engaging and very, very safe. Like your child's not going to sprain an ankle. They're not going to do anything like this. These are always something that you kind of want to take time to consider at the end of your session, just because, or I'm sorry, but while you are like writing a program. If you've got like a bunch of really dangerous stuff in a row, like that's going to put parents on edge. And so, and it's, the kid might have a blast. Your youth might be like, that was the most fun thing ever because youths love doing dangerous stuff. But like the parents are the ones who are like signing the checks. So, you got to be cautious there. And then always ask yourself and remind yourself, like, how is it that children respond differently to exercise compared to youth? So you always have that perspective whenever you're writing a program. You want to kind of default towards the cardio section rather than defaulting towards the muscle building and aerobics section, right? Okay, so we're going to go ahead and before we dive into seniors here, I want to kind of go through our whole SOAP notes and really like make this clear. So again, you can see our subjective information, right? Notice how like our client's name is in the subjective information. His favorite foods are in the subjective information. We've got information about like any injuries that he accrued. So like he did sprain his ankle last year playing soccer. And then his goal is to be the greatest soccer player in the world. Our goal for him is to be active 60 minutes a day. So it's kind of fun. You can kind of break down like, I can't measure any of this information, right? I cannot measure my client's likes and dislikes. I can't measure his favorite foods, his injuries, right? How much they're affecting him. And like goals are obviously very immeasurable, right? For the most part. So these are all the pieces of subjective information that are most relevant. So if I were to give you these SOAP notes, this would be a pretty good guideline already for you to write a program for this client, right? And that's really the purpose of our SOAP notes, right? They kind of act as like a roadmap for whenever we're writing programs in the future. Then our objective information, this is the information that we can measure, right? We know that he's 10 years old, 85 pounds and 4'9". And then here's what's interesting about SOAP notes, guys. You don't always have to, you don't have to go in order. It's not like you have to have this part filled out, then this part filled out, then this part filled out. You'll notice some of our information from the A on SOAP notes, our assessments, is what is filled in up here in our objective information, for instance, right? So like the assessments that are most relevant to us were an overhead squat, the 10 push-up assessment, the single leg balance, and a quarter-mile run assessment, right? These are the 4 that we find are really relevant to this client's goals, right? These are all going to help him be the world's greatest soccer champion. And it's going to help us make sure that he's 60 minutes a day. So when we did that overhead squat assessment, something that we found was that he experiences an anterior pelvic tilt, and he's got feet flattening, and he's got knees caving in. So he's got a little bit of pronation in the foot and ankle complex, and he's got a low back arch, right? All things that we are seeing right here, right? So because those are things that we see, when we get down to our plan section later, we're going to know exactly what type of stretches to perform with this client. If he's got an anterior pelvic tilt, he's probably got a tight lower back and tight hip flexors, right? And we want to strengthen his core in order to get that back to a neutral place. Because he's got that ankle sprain on his left foot where because he sprained his left ankle, we're going to look for excessive pronation there. And sure enough, his left knee caves in more than his right one does. So he's experiencing a little bit of weakness on that side. So we're definitely going to make sure that we loosen up those calf muscles, strengthen the anterior muscles, but most importantly, we're going to work on that glute, especially on that left side, right? When he did his quarter mile run, it took him 3 minutes and 28 seconds. So we're just going to see if that drops lower and lower every time we perform this assessment. And on his push-up assessment, he got 8 on his first try. And we can look for improvements in that as we go on. So you can see we filled in our objective information after we performed the assessment. So this is like this is like a roadmap, right? This is a living, working document. It's not like you just write it all out and get to your programming, right? This is stuff that like you fill out and you can bounce all around the sheet. It's not like you can't add more to the subjective stuff. If you're training Billy in his 3rd week and he's like, he says, like I also really want to get better. I want to learn how to do a pull-up because I saw it on Instagram or something. I don't know what type of 10-year-old is on Instagram, but actually maybe I don't know. He says, like I saw this thing called a pull-up. Do you know how to do pull-ups? And then like now his goal is to like learn how to do that, right? So we can totally add to that later on. It's not like this is something you write out and leave alone forever. So our general plan for this first month, right? What we are looking at before every game, before every session, right? We want to make sure that we do at least a little bit of a 5-minute run, just so we can get like his entire aerobic system kind of primed up and get him like into exercise mode. So doing a ladder for 5 minutes, for instance, would be a really good one. Running a few laps or playing just like a fun cardio game. Any of these could be a really good way to just do 5 minutes of cardio, right? Rather than like when you have your traditional client, you throw them on the treadmill for 5 minutes, right? We want to play soccer 3 times per week, right? So hopefully he's going to soccer practice plenty, or practicing at home. And then when it comes to resistance training, like I said, we're going to do, coaching once per week. And then if we can teach the parents how to do some of these movements, there's no reason he can't do this multiple sessions, right? There's no reason he can't do this multiple times per week on his own. But like I said, 1 to 2 sets, 8 to 12 reps. We're only doing body weight exercises. We are going to do them as a circuit, and we're focusing on the stabilization level. So if I were to pull up an OPT template, we could, I need a blank OPT template. We pull up like a blank OPT template and we decide to write a program out. It's all body weight exercises. So we could keep it really simple. We could go body weight squats, into push-ups, into walking lunges, we want to do body weight exercises. So need like another good upper body one. Yeah, I'll probably go decline push-ups to be honest. Decline, and that might be a little bit tough for a 10-year-old on their shoulders. So we'll do like mountain climbers. That's a decent one. And then we'll look at like a side shuffling, and then go into shoulder. Actually, let's go into T-planks. Right, so they do that thing where they reach, right? So just a little bit of like upper body work, lower body work, upper body work, lower body work. We're just going to do that because it's a good way to kind of evenly distribute the blood. And that's going to feel like cardio, right? So we'll do 2 sets of everything, and we'll focus on 12 reps for everything. Except for the single-sided exercise, we'll do 12 each. Oh, and actually, rather than side shuffling, we'll do 30 seconds just because there's no really way to do that for reps. And then we'll do 12 each there. So there's our very, 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 very basic, right? And I could rewrite this every time before our session starts, right? I'm probably not going to. I'll probably give them a routine that he can stick to and get used to so that the parents and, he can memorize all these things and get used to doing it and make it part of his routine. But with this guideline that I kind of wrote out here, it gives me a template and a series of rules that make it very easy for me to follow anytime I want to write like a new program. So that's why SOAP notes are handy. Like, let's say like Robert, let's say you and I are sharing a client, right? If I write out a program, you can write out a program, and both of them are still going to fit like our overall goals. They're all going to work within the SOAP thing, even if we are two totally different trainers picking two totally different sets of exercises, the energy system, the intensity, all that stuff is going to remain the same for the most part. And then when it comes to flexibility training, we're going to pick 3 to 5 foam rolling exercises as well as static stretches before every session. And the muscles we're primarily going to focus on, because we saw a low back arch and knees caving in, are going to be the gastrocnemius, the soleus, and the hamstrings, and the quads, right? Quads are going to really help with those hip flexors. The hamstrings are going to really help by allowing his glutes to do most of the work, right? And I'd probably I'd put another little note in here. I'd probably pick, if I had to like modify this a little bit right here, I'd probably say something like our stabilization exercises focus on developing core and glute strength, right? Because that's what's going to help sort of address that anterior pelvic tilt. We're going to strengthen the stabilizer, so doing lots of like planks and things like that. And then we're going to focus on glute strength with lots of things like hip thrust, glute bridges, and the likes. So that is that's a general SOAP note. This is going to be downloadable for you guys. I'm going to put this in the email today, so you can kind of see an example of what like a standard SOAP note looks like. Do you guys have any questions about writing a program for youths? Does all that make sense when it comes to like our SOAP notes for youth clients? Do you guys have any questions on that?
Yeah, I guess. My thing is like off of the SOAP notes and what we created in the OPT template, it seems kind of basic. So how can we sell the parents as far as in, look, this is why your child would need a personal trainer, rather than them being able to just, they get these same exercises at school, or something like that.
Yeah.
You kind of get where I'm going?
Yeah, I do. It's interesting. It's funny. I would almost argue the fact that like this is more complicated looking than you think. Like it is really simple to us because we're like professionals in this industry. But I would actually argue like if you were to break this down for a parent, they would go, "Oh my God, you know what you're talking about. This is great." And it does seem really basic to us, but I think that is what kind of separates us as professionals from like amateurs. But there's no reason you couldn't break this down even further for like a client. If you were to like do this in front of them, you could talk about like, specifically what soccer drills you're going to do. You could lay those out and be like, all right, we're going to do like, a drill where we do like a 2-ins, which is a speed ladder drill, over to like a T drill, which is a cone drill. And then we'll have like a small soccer net that they have to like kick. And that kind of thing is going to help work on like their speed, agility, quickness, and coordination when it comes to like kicking that soccer ball, which sounds like exactly what he's interested in. So like the more you break that down, the more parents are going to be on board with exactly what you're talking about. Is that track?
Yeah. I guess I was kind of going off of it was my kid, like that's something kind of easy. That's something that I already know.
Yeah.
Prior to even being in Sochi, like these are simple exercises that I would probably run my kid through anyways,
Yeah, and there's no reason you can't write more complicated versions, like this is definitely like a coaching situation where like we're training this kid like once a week. So, without being with him constantly, it makes a lot more sense to choose very basic body weight exercises. But there's no reason you couldn't do any of that more advanced stuff, you could absolutely throw more advanced versions their ways. You just got to be cautious because again, it is like a youth, right? So because of that, you want to make sure that you're not going like too advanced because then they might not be able to follow the program. you know. But I love that. I mean, write your programs as advanced and challenging as you want, that's great. Any other questions before we move on to the senior side of things? All right. So let's take a look. Let's take a look at senior fitness training, right? Now, again, this is going to be very basic, very, very basic. And then we are going to get very much more in depth with basic. This is almost like a cup of what you are going to learn gallons of at the end of this course. So this class, let's see, this is day 3 today. So 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So Monday is going to be our final exam. And then on the next Tuesday, the 20th, is where we will be starting. That's where we're going to be starting our senior fitness program design class. So you're definitely going to get a much more advanced version of all of this information in a little over a week. But for now, let's look at this one here. So by the middle of the century, it's estimated that 87 people, or 21% of the population, are going to be 65 or older. So that's 1 in 5 people are going to be, retired seniors. So because of that, we definitely know that there are going to be more complications due to chronic illnesses and things like that. Particularly 2 of them that we are going to be looking at are going to be things like arteriosclerosis and atherosclerosis. So both of these are going to be very common in older populations. We just know that as we get older, our blood vessels tend to get really thin, which means that we might have trouble with blood pressure issues, or they tend to get very stiff, which also tend to lead to blood pressure issues. So both of those things are challenges that seniors deal with a lot, not to mention any of the other very, 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 very common chronic illnesses that we'll be looking at for the rest of this course. So if we know that 1 in 5 people, 20% of the population, are going to be dealing with some type of these chronic diseases, we want to make sure that we have enough working fitness professionals to kind of handle that load. So we got to look at some of the physiologic changes that are going to happen in our senior adults. Particularly these 2 are the most common. But again, these things are going to lead to comorbidities, right? We know that like when our blood vessels get like really stiff, that can lead to blood pooling in the legs, and that can lead to peripheral arterial disease or blood clots and things like that. So some of the physiologic changes that we see in senior populations are going to be pretty basic. They're ones that kind of, come to mind. We see a lower max heart rate, for instance. The capacity for the heart to beat at a super high rate is just decreased. The heart's old and tired. Leave it alone. We also see a lower cardiac output. It doesn't have as much strength to pump blood as efficiently throughout the body, and so without that ability to contract and shoot blood effectively throughout the body, we're going to see a lower cardiac output. So that's a lower performance of the heart. We see a decrease in muscle mass because as we get older, this is kind of fun actually, we see a shift from type 2 muscle fibers to more type 1 muscle fibers. I don't know if you guys have ever heard this, but they'll say like golfers get better the older they get. And part of that is because like golf is very much like a type 1 sport. Yeah, it's an endurance-based sport with a lot of finesse. And so like as we get older, we tend to shift from our heavy lifting type 2 muscle fibers to our light endurance type 1 muscle fibers. So obviously one of the differences we know about type 2 versus type 1 fibers tend to be smaller in size, and so we see less muscle mass as we get older. We're also going to see a decrease in balance and coordination. So obviously with that, we want to have good balance. So we're going to try to decrease that deterioration as much as possible by doing lots and lots and lots of balance training with our senior clients. We see a decrease in our connective tissue elasticity, meaning that like we just get stiff as we get older, So because of that decrease in flexibility, guess what? We're going to spend a lot of time focusing on increasing that flexibility. So flexibility training is going to be hugely, hugely important with our senior clients. And then we also see a decrease in bone mineral density. So one thing that we know is very common as we get older is our bone density does decrease substantially. So we want to spend a lot of time doing weight-bearing exercise in particular to try to enhance that bone mineral density. So those are some of the complications with getting older. There's no avoiding them, for the most part, except through, general healthy training. So we're going to try and keep our flexibility as long as we can. We're going to try and keep that bone density as high as we can for years, keep our muscle mass, and all of that is going to hopefully be is going to happen and occur, thanks to our strength training and things like that. So what are our primary focuses, right? Well, one of the most important capacities for our senior clients, and this sounds kind of basic and really simple, but honestly, one of the most important things that we want to make sure we are doing with senior clients is maintaining the ability to walk without issue, right? So maintaining balance and coordination so that your client can stay upright as long as possible is huge. We're going to talk more about this later, but how many often have you guys seen, like I'm sure we all have grandparents where you've seen this, they start doing like the old biddy shuffle. They start doing like this kind of walk, right? The reason that happens is because like as we get older, we lose our balance and we lose our coordination. And so like the confidence that you have to take a large step and like shift from one leg to another and like rely on, falling to the ground basically, that confidence like disappears as we get older when you lose your balance and coordination. So by improving your balance and coordination, you have more confidence to walk and take larger steps. The idea is that like a smaller step means that if you ever clip something with your foot, you're less likely to fall, This is going to be a weird, analogy and connection, but Robert, you were just saying your older dog, right? You've got a much older dog, right?
Yeah.
And can it see very well?
Are you talking about the one that went blind?
Yeah. You're saying it went totally blind, right?
Oh, okay. Well, she's not considered a senior, but I had one. Yeah, she's 7, but the one that passed, she was 10, so she was kind of up in that area.
But you'll see that, like, I'm sure you'll notice like she's much more cautious about how she walks around now, right?
Yes, most definitely.
Right. So that like the reason, like it's like when you close your eyes, try to walk, so you can walk really slow and you start doing the shuffle, like you're like, I don't know what's below me and I don't have confidence that like if I were to take a large step, if I hit something with my foot, I'm gonna eat it, like so. Seniors have that, imagine, going on basically 24 hours a day. They don't have like the confidence that they had when they were like youthful to take these large steps because they just don't feel as balanced. They don't have as much coordination. So you can start to see where like a lot of what we're going to be talking about for the next few weeks is just working on balance, right? Working on our ability to like stand and walk. And that's why you're also going to see like a lot of our assessments are going to be modified. And they're all about being able to get up from a chair and walk comfortably, right? And that's why we have like that assessment I told you about a couple days ago, the tug test, right? It's the timed up and go assessment where you get out of the chair, walk around a cone and sit. Seems really simple, but like that's a huge assessment for our senior clients. So preventing falls is going to be a key issue. Balance training is a key issue, right? These are definitely things we're going to be looking at. And one of the other things that is actually very important for our senior clients is making exercise comfortable. We know that like sometimes seniors, or you'll even see this in like obese populations where sometimes people get like self-conscious about going to the gym, which to me is like tragic and should be avoided at all costs. I can't imagine feeling uncomfortable or unwelcome in my favorite place. I love the gym. And so the idea that it could be uncomfortable for someone like makes me really upset. So make your clients feel as comfortable as possible. Do not make it an intimidating environment. Make it as inviting as possible so that your senior clients do feel comfortable, they do feel welcome, and they want to come to the gym regularly. And then again, we're seeing this be very common here. We're going to see weight-bearing exercise is going to be most recommended. We know that weight-bearing exercise has the most positive effects on bone density. So lifting weights is actually great for your senior clients. So it should actually be a priority here. So we want to focus on preventing immobility, right? We want to use weight-bearing activities, particularly light weights. You know, it doesn't have to be like super heavy to still have bone density effects. You know, we're going to go low intensity here. So in general, as we're looking at it, right, the mode, the type in our fit principles, right, stationary or recumbent cycling are both really comfortable because those are things where they can be seated, so that will give them a little bit of confidence. So cycling exercises are really helpful. Aquatic exercise is good, and no, it's not bone density increasing. Like aquatic exercise doesn't have the positive bone density effects. But aquatic exercise is great for your senior clients because if they do have things like arthritis, that can take the pressure off their joints. And so they can develop their cardio training very effectively with pool training. Even though it may not be as effective for their muscles, it can be really, really, really great for like the rest of their body, right? So you've heard me say this before. Like I always talk about how I am much, much, much a larger fan of like weight bearing exercise. But it doesn't mean that I don't appreciate non-weight bearing activity. You know, that stuff is still great, just not for your bone mineral density. So I'm still a huge fan of aqua aerobics. And then they can go like treadmill. Just make sure that if they do a treadmill with your senior clients, they have some type of like handrail support so they feel confident. Now, our frequency is definitely going to be lower than it is with youths. We're going to see 3 to 5 days per week for moderate intensity, or maybe 3 days a week vigorous. So we're seeing that like, you know, 5 days a week. If you do 30 minutes a day, that's your 150 minutes per week. But you can cut that in half if you're doing high intensity exercise. You know, you only need 75 minutes per week if it's vigorous, you know. So intensity, you're going to see a pretty big range here, anywhere from 40 to 85% of their peak VO2. So that's going to be anywhere from zone 1 up to zone 3. So kind of a wide range here, you know, for our senior clients. So that's honestly not super helpful. Basically what they're showing you here, it's not helpful in terms of like being a guideline, but it is helpful in the fact that it means that like, if your client can handle it, give them the hard cardio, you know, just make sure your client can handle it. That's what they're saying. You can use a wide range here. Our movement assessments, pretty standard stuff here until we see one little change. Pushing, pulling assessments, overhead squats, all of those are going to be really helpful. Single leg balance assessment, generally because our seniors don't have as good of a balance, we're going to remove the single leg squat. I will say, if your client can handle the single leg squat, go for it, you know. But if they can't, like, you know, if they're having trouble just standing on one leg, that's enough information for you. You know, you're going to say, great, we know you struggle with your balance. Therefore, I'm going to write a program that works on your balance. But then you can see the sitting and standing into a chair. So there is an assessment we're going to learn in the senior class coming up, like I said, next week, which is the tug test, right? And like I said, it is as simple as from a seated position. This would be a bad chair, by the way, because it's number 1, too high, and number 2, it's a stool. But you set a cone a few yards away, and they're going to stand up without using their hands, walk around that cone, and go back to the chair and sit down. And you are going to test how long it takes them to do that assessment. And that is a what we call a fall risk assessment, right? You are you are assessing how much of a risk they are at falling, right? Hopefully they are low risk, you know? So that is what we're going to look at in terms of our movement assessments, right? Flexibility, we're going to focus mostly on self-myofascial release and static stretches with our senior clients. However, just be cautious here. I don't think it actually says it in this table, but you'll see it in our senior class later. Be cautious with self-myofascial release. It could lead to bruising in your senior clients, and that's certainly not something we want to see. So foam rolling might be a little bit too much pressure sometimes. So just make sure that you're being gentle. In general, for resistance training, we're going to focus on 1 to 3 sets, anywhere from 8 to 20 repetitions. So we really are using pretty much the entire OPT model here, minus maximum strength. So we're not going any lower than 8 repetitions, but we can go as high as 20. And that's going to be anywhere, because of that giant range, anywhere from 40 to 80% of their 1 rep max. 80% corresponds with your 8 repetition, 40% is going to correspond with your 20 repetition. So we're seeing anywhere in that range there. And we're going to focus 3 to 5 days per week in that strength training. So that matches up pretty cleanly with our frequency up here. Obviously, you want to master phase 1 before you ever move on to any of the other phases. So your client should be able to do, proper stabilization movements before they ever try to do any of the other types of movements. And then phases 2 to 5 should be based on like postural control. They can do the movements and they can do them perfectly. Of course, you can give them heavier versions. If they know how to do a great stability ball chest press, give them a bench press, go for it, but if they can't like keep their arm in alignment while they're doing, horizontal adduction, if they're not doing it properly, don't give them a more advanced version, start on the basic stuff and then work them up. Just like really any other client. So special considerations, you can see this is general guidelines. Progression should be slow, well monitored, and always based on postural control. And they should be progressed, if possible, towards free sitting or standing. So start your client in like a seated position with plenty of support, but then, your goal is to get them to stay upright and walking their whole life. So like start them with like a seated version, and then eventually if we can get them to like standing, and it doesn't say it here, but eventually get them to one leg, so like maybe they're like, doing a seated bicep curl, right? Then they do a seated bicep curl with no support. So they're like maybe leaning against the bench. Then they're doing it like not leaning against the bench. Then they're doing it standing, right? And then eventually they're doing single leg bicep curls. And that's awesome. That's a huge improvement in mobility slowly over time. Make sure your client is breathing normal. Do not do that Valsalva maneuver that I mentioned. Remember, that's where you take that big deep breath in, purse your lips, and then breathe like that, right? That like, heavy deadlifter, like, like your heavy bench presser, right? That's a great technique, and I'm a huge fan of Valsalva. Not with our senior clients, right? Remember, they've got thinner blood vessels, they've got harder blood vessels. Both of those things are not going to be good when you are massively raising your pressure. They could blow a gasket, so that's definitely not something we want to do with our senior clients. Oh, it does say it here, right? It does say it here. Okay. If your client cannot tolerate foam rolling due to bruising and things like that, or if they can't do the static stretches because it literally feels too painful, they can do slow rhythmic or dynamic stretches. When I say slow rhythmic, I mean they can do basically active stretches, just little tiny stretches with like a little pause in between. Just make sure they're not, snapping or anything like that. So that's what we are looking at there. So again, these are some of the questions you want to ask yourself before writing a program. How are you going to make this engaging, but also safe for your senior clients? Make sure that they feel invited to the gym, but make sure that like they feel safe and encouraged to exercise. What are some of your other special considerations? Like with your senior clients, like what do you need to do to make sure that they are comfortable? And when I say special considerations, we know falling is a huge risk factor here, right? So we're going to make sure the gym floor is clean. We're going to make sure that we are working out an environment that is safe and not cluttered with stuff laying around. You're always going to rack your weights and things like that in between sets. So those are some of the special considerations you do want to make. And then what type of exercises are most appropriate for your senior client? Like, if you are looking in your textbook and it says, a seated dumbbell chest press, that's, well, there is no seated. There's a lying dumbbell chest press, right? Let's say you're doing a bench dumbbell chest press, you're laying on a bench. That's great. Is that what's most appropriate for your senior client? If they have like blood pressure issues and laying back gives them like spotty vision, maybe that's not most appropriate. Maybe you do start them on a chest press machine. I know that trainers love to crap on machines. I know we love to all be like, no, you shouldn't do machines. You should always do free weights. I love free weights. I love them, but for your senior clients, sometimes the priority is just simply to keep them in an environment where they can stay upright, right? So a chest press machine could be a really efficient, effective choice for a senior client. So that's where we're going to kind of look at things for our senior clients. That gives us general guidelines for writing really effective SOAP notes there and writing really effective workouts. And honestly, I know it's brief, but like, do you guys have any questions on the senior stuff? Noel, Robert, questions, comments, concerns?
Seniors are considered 65 plus, correct?
Yeah,
60.
I mean, officially. Here's the thing. I love one of the literally the first day in the senior class. We're gonna talk about the different types of aging, right? Age is totally a number. It's a number that is labeled based on when you were born. But like, I my neighbors like are in their 70s, and they look way more youthful than my parents in their 50s. Love my parents. They've just had a very hard life of, moving furniture for years. It takes its toll. So yes, 65 and older is considered senior, but you may have a client who's in their 50s who is, acting like very much a senior. So we're gonna look at that later on, but yeah, that's the official term. God, any other questions, guys? Well, heck, how'd you guys feel about homework 1? Pretty easy?
Like the easiest homework I've ever taken so far.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the rest of them in this class are going to be that way as well. All right. Well, I'm not going to hold you guys hostage and try to make up more time for today. That honestly is what we've got. It's a great time. If you haven't finished them yet, you can work on your flashcards. Keep going back to that kinesiology stuff. Review some of the kinesiology videos. That's a great way to spend your time. But I'm gonna let you guys. I'm gonna let you guys out of here for the day, and I will see all y'all tomorrow.
I do have a question, Brad, but this has nothing to do with the senior or the youth population.
Gotcha. Here, let me kill the recording.
All right.
You guys.